One of the most common contentions regarding the conviction of Lucy Letby is that when she was removed from her nursing duties, deaths on the unit dried up almost completely. Now, it's well known that the unit was downgraded, and this is a major factor in this statistic, but the phenomenon was actually predicted at the time in email correspondence that was sent at the Countess of Chester in 2016, and I'm going to go over that in this video. So we can see here on the screen in a Reddit post of some years ago, I think a few years ago now, there's a discussion about Dr. John Gibbs featuring in the Trial of Lucy Letby podcast, and it was mentioned during this podcast that deaths stopped as soon as Lucy Letby was removed from the unit. Now, I should mention that we now know that's not true, because there's been this article in the Daily Telegraph which indicates that there were deaths in the immediate period after Lucy was removed from the unit, and that Cheshire Police indeed investigated these deaths. So even that is not true. But in this video, we're going to examine the legitimacy of this assertion. So before we go any further, I should say that Dr. John Gibbs has been significantly more reasonable in public comment than, for example, Dr. Stephen Bury or Dr. Ravi Jairam, and seems to have been kind of ushered along by them, essentially. But there's a couple of notes here about there being two significant changes to the unit, which is that they reduced the number of babies that slept on the unit, and they increased the minimum gestation from 27 to 32 weeks. What isn't mentioned in this post is the downgrading of the unit. So these phenomena and this differing workload they were dealing with was defined by the fact that the neonatal unit was downgraded to the lowest possible form of neonatal unit, which has other consequences beyond the two that are mentioned here, which I'll get into later in the video. It's also mentioned here that Dr. Gibbs claimed that the fall in deaths was much bigger than the changes accounted for. In response to that, someone has said, not without justification here on Reddit, did he mention how he reached his conclusion? And as I understand, he's a paediatrician. What qualifies him to make such a statement? Of course, I would suggest that he didn't have any qualifications at all, and it was a rather flippant remark that is essentially unfounded. But to his credit, in this email from the Thirlwell inquiry, this is an email, an internal email from 2016, Dr. Gibbs writes here that the increase in neonatal mortality that we've experienced over the last 18 months might be within an expected statistical variance, but I'm not sure because my stats isn't good enough. So essentially he talks here about some of these statistical aspects of the case. Of course, we know the massive problems with this by now, but more importantly, he concedes he hasn't really got any maths or statistics ability, knowledge or qualifications. His instinct is absolutely correct. And now we've had people with those credentials who've mentioned the problems with what occurred both in the investigation and in the ultimate conviction of Lucy Letby. So when he's saying here that the fall is much greater than the changes should account for, we can reasonably assume that even if he had engaged in a significant investigation of this mathematically or statistically, he's not qualified to do so, but it's highly unlikely, based on these comments, that ever occurred on the unit. What happened on this unit, as far as we're able to ascertain, is that they had an impression about something and they just went with that impression. They didn't really do what you could describe as proper science, and certainly not a proper investigation. Dr. Gibbs was also cross-examined during the court case, and when he was asked by Ben Myers why he didn't contact the police sooner, he admitted that it was difficult to do that because Nurse Letby seemed to be involved in all of the cases that involved me. So this just underlines that statistical coincidence can occur with regard to doctors as well as nurses. Of course, doctors, I think it's reasonable to say, tend to be less present on the unit because the nurses are essentially the first port of call for dealing with emergencies. So we're going to look at this email correspondence between 4 individuals on the unit that were involved with the Countess of Chester in 2016. And this email correspondence outlines the fact that the fall in deaths was absolutely predicted at the time. People were aware of it. The Countess of Chester was aware of it. People that were working on the unit were aware of it. People that were affiliated with the Countess of Chester were aware of it. So the idea that it was some sort of revelation at a later date is completely without foundation. The first of these four people is Corinne Slingo, who's a legal professional who was involved with the Countess of Chester at the time. It's stated here that Corinne now leads the National Healthcare Regulatory Team advising on all aspects of healthcare law, and she works in Bristol. I don't know if that's a new role for her, but this is what she does. The last time I looked it up, and she was involved in sort of medico-legal matters at the time. The second person named in this document, the People and Organisational Development representative from the Countess of Chester at this time is Sue Hodkinson, who was Director of Human Resources and Organisational Development at the hospital. The third person named, this is document from a Board of Directors Agenda and Papers from July 2017. Third person named is Debbie Cleverly. I don't think she's actually a PA. I think she's more of an administrator. You see mentioned here with regard to contacting a PA, so she probably performs some administrative duties as well at the hospital. The fourth person, Ian Pace, who was actually interviewed on the same day at the Thirlwell inquiry, Thursday the 21st of November, along with 2024, I should say, along with Corinne Slingo, who's the first person that I mentioned, former legal advisor to the Countess of Chester. Ian Pace is important in other issues. Ian Pace makes some very important comments about Lucy and about constructive dismissal. So in this email from July 2017, Corinne Slingo writes the following: based on the fact that the only current evidence for any clinical concern is the potentially circumstantial fact that one particular nurse was on shift on more occasions than others at the point when neonatal deaths arose, and there are also death deteriorations that occurred when she was not on shift, and no incidents have been linked to their practice, and no previous concerns of whistleblowing have arisen in respect to the individual or the unit, and there is currently no cause of death or thematic clinical basis to suggest the deaths are connected to each other or connected by common intervention, deliberate or not, and approximately 7 of the deaths have also been through the coronial system, with no common feature or issue arising from the individual's care. I wanted to highlight that firstly, because this is Corinne Slingo recognising what so many of us have recognised since, which is that incidents on the unit had already been investigated very thoroughly and no evidence of wrongdoing was found. That is what she's saying here. She's saying, look, we've looked at this carefully, we've looked at this through the coronial system, there's nothing to indicate there should be any concern. That is what she is stating in this initial passage. Now, what should have happened at this time, if anything at all? It's arguable that nothing at all should have happened because all they had was some deaths, and it was a spike, but when they examined the deaths pretty thoroughly, there was no indication that they were for anything other than natural causes. Now, given the level of medical error and problems on the unit that are now apparent, there obviously is an argument for examining these deaths, but there's no argument for the case being passed to the police based on the context that we understand. They only had one unascertained or unexplained deaths. One death, I should say, not deaths, because this is when Lucy's removed from the unit. Now, there were later deaths that post-date this communication, but they don't have, it's not as if they have an extraordinarily large number. They have something that should be cause for concern, and maybe they should have medically investigated that, but there is nothing here, based on the comments of Corinne Slingo, based on what we understand, there is nothing here to indicate that there should have been police involvement. Obviously, we know there's nothing concrete. There never was, there never is, there never will be. But there was nothing here to even say, let's phone the police. Nothing. However, if they were going to make further investigations at this point, what they should have done was a multidisciplinary review. We know that only too well now, because that's what the National Crime Agency told the police to do. It's just that the police were unable to do that. They should have been able to do it. They were told what to do. They just failed to do it. But the hospital could have contacted the top healthcare bodies and said, look, we want further expert analysis of these deaths because we're not 100% happy with the conclusions that have been drawn by 2 pathologists and a coroner Neonatologists have looked at the case as well. That would seem to be quite significant to me, quite sufficient. But if there was anything, there should have been an extensive multidiscipline review, which never happened. And Dr. Dewi Evans should never have been called in by the police and then given years and years and years to come up with countless explanations that came to the conclusion that Lucy Letby was guilty, while at the same time saying, oh, don't involve anyone else. And in a future video, I'm going to go through his 2019 witness statement to the police, and at that time, they still didn't have radiography information. Now, I've mentioned that in a previous video, but we're going to go over the whole document soon because not many people have seen that document. The next thing that Corinne Slingo states in her email is that from a patient safety perspective, the decision to move the individual to a non-clinical role is absolutely right, irrespective of the rights or wrongs of the suspicions cast upon her involvement in the heightened mortality issue. The individual will now be under enormous pressure, and that of itself creates additional patient safety risks that needed to be managed. And taking it offline from clinical duties does this. So I just wanted to mention this briefly because a lot of people talk about this. Corinne Slingo is one of them. This myth that Lucy was removed from the unit due to suspicion, which is just categorically untrue. And again, you see Corinne Slingo stating it here. It's stated by nurses on the unit. We know that's not why Lucy was removed. It has nothing to do with the suspicion. The consultants were pushing and pushing and pushing, but that wasn't the reason she was taken off the unit. The reason she was taken off the unit was for her own protection. That's absolutely true. So the critical paragraph of this email is here, where Corinne Slingo says, there is a likelihood that having changed the admissions criteria to remove the highest risk of sub-32-week neonates, which I agree is the right step, that the mortality rate will drop significantly in any event, and that could easily be interpreted as being due to the removal of the individual as the timescales coincide. That may make life much more difficult for her and also for the trust in trying to identify the true cause of the spike in mortality for this group of babies. So I just want to go over this again. Firstly, Corinne Slingo notes that they're going to change the admissions criteria. They're going to downgrade the unit and they're not going to deal with at-risk neonates. It's going to be the lowest level unit considering these circumstances. It's likely that the mortality rate will drop significantly, she states, and this could be interpreted as being due to the removal of Lucy Letby as the timescales coincide. She then rightly notes that this could make life a lot more difficult for Lucy, which is an enormous understatement. And equally, I suppose you could describe this as a side issue, but in fact, I think it's critically important that it made it hard to identify what was causing the spike in mortality, although as they never really tried, that's not really as relevant. I still think it would have been absolutely feasible to understand what was and identify what was causing the spike in mortality. It's just there was no real, I don't know if belief is the right word, there was no real drive, certainly, among the consultant body to do that based on what we've seen. They were happy it wasn't their fault, and they were perfectly happy with that conclusion. And so they never wanted things to be investigated, and they never were. They still haven't been properly investigated now. I mean, obviously by independent researchers, obviously by the panel, there has been a lot of progress, but there still needs to be a thorough investigation of what occurred at the hospital, and that will come one day. But it still hasn't happened to the degree that it should. So this is essentially quite an astute comment from Corinne Slingo that obviously Dr. Brewery and Dr. Jairam have completely disregarded. But it indicates in crystal clear clarity that this was communicated to the hospital. Not one person, but to the hospital, because this is an email chain. There are multiple people here that are aware of this now, that it's likely, basically inevitable, that the mortality rate is going to drop because simply the downgrading of the unit. In fact, even if they hadn't downgraded the unit, the mortality rate probably would have dropped anyway because it's a spike. Spikes happen, then they go down. Otherwise, they're not a spike. So this notion that deaths suddenly dried up when Lucy was moved to a clerical position, this has been used evidentially. It was used in court. It's been cited continually, particularly by consultants on the unit. It's been cited by people that are still determined to believe that Lucy Letby is guilty. We've all seen, the death stopped when she came off the unit. But actually, not only was there an explanation for this that is entirely reasonable, but someone provided this explanation before it happened, before it was investigated, before it could ever be cited as an argument. And multiple people at the hospital saw this and knew this, and yet it was still used in court. I wanted to highlight this document as well from April 2017. This was yet another document. We've seen so many over the months that I've been doing this channel that was only released after the public inquiry was concluded. Again, this is an email with Sue Hodgkinson. And in this email, Corinne Slingo essentially outlines the fact that the neonatal unit mortality concern has been investigated in several ways. Firstly, by the Royal College Review that we all know about, that identified no single root cause nor expressly confirmed avoidable death, and outlined several criticisms. The report has been shared with both the Care Quality Commission and the coroner. She also cites the Forensic Pathology Review, also shared with key stakeholders, a review of each case by the medical director. I'm not sure what form the output from this may have taken. This will be relevant for next steps, and she goes on to talk about the police investigation and HR investigation following a grievance brought by the nurse, and closely cooperation has continued with HM Coroner, including meetings to share the outcome of investigations in order to give the coroner the opportunity to reopen inquests or take any other steps as discussed. The coroner has a statutory power to refer matters within his jury restriction to the police if he's concerned the crime may have been commissioned, and thus far this has not happened. So it shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have happened because when it was referred to the police, there was no evidence whatsoever. That's explicitly stated in Cheshire Police documents, not just one, several documents, numerous times, that they had no evidence when it was passed to them. It's only when Dr. Brary and Dr. Jairam go to visit Cheshire Police with Dr. Susie Holt that suddenly Cheshire Police decide to have an investigation. The point here, though, is that Corinne Slingo is outlining that the deaths have already been investigated in numerous different ways. She didn't actually reference the fact that the Care Quality Commission visited the hospital as well, even though they did a tremendously bad job as usual. And despite all those investigations, there's been no evidence of wrongdoing. And as mentioned here, the coroner, who has a statutory power, and I would say pretty much a statutory obligation to refer if they were concerned there'd been a crime. I'm sure Stephanie would come on here and tell you it's absolutely a statutory obligation. They didn't do that because there's no evidence for this. So I think it's pretty outrageous that the medical director, Ian Harvey, has essentially been hauled over the coals so publicly and been treated abominably when the record at Thirlwell indicates that I can't see what else he could have done. As you can probably imagine, I've written about this extensively in my book because there's so much information from Thirlwell in these documents that somehow the inquiry never managed to discuss. But we know exactly what was going on behind the scenes of this hospital. It's all there in black and white. And I should mention this, and it's quite timely. I've been speaking to a doctor today, and she told me that this Nottingham maternity scandal that I'm sure you've all heard about, it's the front page of the Daily Mail today. She said the overlap with the Countess of Chester, with the same issues coming up, is almost uncanny. It's like literally exactly the same. All the things that we've seen with this hospital are there in Nottingham in black and white as well. So anyway, as I've already discussed on this channel, the Countess of Chester remains downgraded at this point in time. I know it's been shown to me and reported to me recently that they've now demolished the old neonatal unit. We were waiting for that to happen. It's happened in the last few weeks. So that's just a pile of rubble now. And they now, from going from this cramped, inadequate neonatal unit with poor sanitation, dealing with definitely level 2 infants and several that certainly needed level 3 care, they've gone from that to a brand new, what looks a very good standard professional unit certainly far better than what they had before dealing with level 1 infants, so it's hardly surprising the results haven't been the same. So if we look at the indictment infants from the court case, the Countess of Chester is now not accepting any infant under 32 weeks gestation. That would have affected multiple infants that were involved with this court case. And I would estimate that approximately 2/3 of these infants wouldn't be on the unit now. Maybe it's more than 2/3, but it's certainly 2/3 of them would not be on the unit now, and I think a good portion of them should never have been on the unit at all, even if it was a competent level 2 unit. So to return to the overarching subject of this video, there is the recognition from Corinne Slingo in this email that as soon as you change the admissions criteria, removing the highest risk sub-32-week neonates, the mortality rate will drop. So the fact it has since been cited in so many different ways as being suspicious is not only not suspicious, not only are there other legitimate and indeed adequate satisfactory reasons to explain this, but also it wasn't a mystery at the time. It's not something that was unexpected. This significantly precedes the case being referred to the police, let alone the court case, and yet this is still being repeated guilelessly, unfairly, misleadingly in court. It's still being repeated by people who believe Lucy Letby is guilty today, even though way back in 2016, 10 years ago now, this email is practically 10 years old, from Corinne Slingo. She already knew that the mortality rate was going to drop, and she told the hospital they could expect a significant drop, and it was just never taken into consideration. Instead, we see this critical meeting, somewhat infamous by now, I would suggest, between Breary, J-Ram and Nigel Wenham and the consultants, where they seed the police with information. Much of it is inaccurate, and one of the things they state is the deaths on the unit have dried up, and we still have unexplained deaths from this period, and we don't know why they occurred. That's very troubling, and they say various other things as well. Of course, I've been through this at length previously, but the idea that the deaths stopped because Lucy came off the unit, not only is there a reasonable explanation for that, but it wasn't a mystery at the time.